yourself, and we'll just get straight to it.
Okay,
Hello
let's
and
do it.
welcome to the stream, and sorry for the delay, everyone. But we are started now, and I'll give the word to Dr. Michael, and he will introduce himself, and then we start. Thank you all for coming.
Uh, okay, well, thank you again, Weeb. Thank you for inviting me once again to your channel. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I had a lot of fun last time, and it was the fastest hour that I think that anybody experienced. I think that some people in the chat had said that we could have gone another hour with the discussion. So I'm happy to be back.
Yeah.
So I'm reporting, logging in here from Webster University's campus in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and a lot of stuff has happened since we last spoke. In fact, a part of me almost wishes that our first chat took place maybe a day or two afterwards, because things were literally unfolding as we were talking.
Yeah.
So I, came back and listened to some of my predictions, which obviously have turned out not all to be true. Things have certainly turned in Ukraine's favor, but I think that we are certainly in this for the long haul here. So I'm delighted to be back. I'm happy to speak with you with what I know, and I hope that the viewers will find what we talk about to be interesting, as well as entertaining.
Hopefully. All right. So I'll do a quick summary of an update I've done on my map, and then we'll go straight to the questions. So starting off, I have made my map clearer in a way that since the referendums are coming up and Russia is going to annex all of these southern areas, I have cleared the map from the DPR and LPR sections and have made everything to be Russian military control, so that there's only 2 colors instead of 4 different colors. I still have Transnistria included because there's always a possibility that that gets involved later on. However, this is the map now. It's much clearer and only 2 colors to make it much simpler. I hope everyone looks forward to my new updates with this new map. So going straight to the questions. We'll start off simple with what everyone has been talking about the past couple of days, where Putin announced the partial mobilization about a week ago, and that is the talk of the town this past week. So what do you think is the effect of the partial mobilization that Russia has announced within Russia? So the effects of the mobilization within Russia.
Well, I remember listening to Putin's speech about a week ago. I have the full translation up on my page with the timestamp where he announces the referendums on the annexation as well as partial mobilization. So this was long predicted, especially within the chatters on various Telegram sites. I think it became all the more necessary once the Kharkiv counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side proved to be as effective as it was. Now, the one thing that is certainly making the attention of media, and certainly this is Western media, is the number of Russians that are now leaving the country. And I don't, it's hard to say whether or not these are actual draft dodgers or whether these are ordinary civilians who kind of see the writing on the wall and realize that partial mobilization is only 300,000. And, officially there is this idea that those that will be called up are those in the Army reserves and those that already have military experience. So we're not going to be dragging people off the streets and, conscripting them. But I think that this has now, I think enough people sort of see that the escalation of conflict is becoming more personal. And, the time to leave, if they had thought about it, was, has happened. Still, Putin will get his 300,000. The number of Russians that are leaving, and again, the numbers are sort of fluctuating between a few 10,000 to over 1 million. He's going to get his 300,000, and that's not going to be that much of an issue. Those that are leaving may have already decided to leave beforehand, as I said, so that's not going to really affect the mobilization. What will happen, I fear more to the point, is that Western media is rather ambivalent on what to classify these people. And I've sort of been hinting at the irony of Russians leaving Russia for Europe, for Germany, for Austria, for Poland, for elsewhere, and running into their Ukrainian counterparts that left months earlier. Right? Russians have been doing in the last 7 days what Ukrainians have been doing in the last 7 months. But yet the media refers to the Ukrainians as refugees, and the Russians as either deserters or people that are refusing the call for combat. There's really nothing separating the Ukrainian that does not want to be thrown into the front and die for the Russian. There have been Ukrainians that have come here into Tashkent, and I've spoken to a number of them, and they've given me their own stories, their own versions of events, and it's to be expected among Russians that this is the time to leave. And I think that we also need to think about that it's more than just the avoiding being called up, but the understanding that I think sanctions are going to now increase. Russia is going to become incredibly isolated. So there's that moment where you feel the window of opportunity to leave is closing fast. So sort of, get out now. And if nothing materializes, that's fine. But if it gets to the point of no return, you're going to be wishing, that you had left. I've also have met a number of Russians, ordinary Russians, over the past few months here in Tashkent that come and go between Moscow and Uzbekistan. Many have decided if they can make their jobs remote and they have, good internet connection, that's that as well. So, we can't interview everybody that's leaving, and we certainly can't conclude that everyone is doing this to avoid being called up for combat. But if they have an opportunity to leave, now is the time. Now is the time definitely to do so. But the effect that this has on the call up, I don't think is going to have that much of an effect. Putin will get his numbers. And if we understand that the 300,000 is just the first batch, and that Shoigu has sort of privately called up for an additional 1 million. The country is 150 million. So will he get, a little more than 1% of the population? Yes. Now, whether they're properly trained and whether they meet the objectives of Putin's plan, remains to be seen.
Okay, so I have a comment on one thing you mentioned, and that is about how the Russian, guess we can call them refugees or deserters or whatever they call them, how they'll be received in Europe if they do decide to travel to Europe. There's actually a very large split. We have seen reports from the Baltic states and Finland saying that with their visa restrictions, they will consider the fleeing Russians on the same level as tourists and will not give them asylum. Then we have seen countries like Germany saying that in their own right, these guys are heroes, according to Western media, that they refuse to fight for Putin and don't want to kill anyone. So there's a lot of mixed reactions between the European countries. It will be very interesting to see how they're received, as you mentioned. And
yeah, I mean, just if I can just briefly comment on that, what it does do is that it also reveals the different levels of opposition against Russia. So we can sort of divide them into the moderates versus the hardliners. The hardline opposition is clearly coming from the Baltic states as well as Poland. Finland has also decided that they're not going to offer them asylum. I mean, this feeds right back into the narrative of Putin and Lavrov that Russians are mistreated, that Russophobia is running rampant, and that diplomacy and humanitarianism is selective. So Russians can kind of feel some solidarity with their Palestinian and Syrian and Iraqi brothers. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians get the VIP treatment.
Mhm. Yeah, and a second comment about how properly trained they are, that is of course unknown, but from the reports we've received so far, the first recruits, for example in Crimea, have now arrived at a training camp at Sevastopol that numbers about 2,500 soldiers who were mobilized with this partial mobilization. And so far, the reports suggest that it will be between 1 to 4 weeks of training for the people who have been in military service within the last 5 years. So it'll mostly just be a refresher with some extra knowledge from the military operation. But other than that, they'll mainly be relying on the training they've received in doing their conscription. And prior to 2021, the conscription in Russia, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was 3 years, where most of it was just pledging to be in the reserves for 2 years, where they had to undergo regular training monthly, while the 1 year is extensive training and deployment. So generally speaking, these are going to be somewhat trained, but the quality of them will be determined once we see them on the battlefield. All right, so if there's no more comments on that topic, then we will go on to the next one, which is I want to ask you what your thoughts are about the referendum that has taken place within Ukraine, which is, of course, the referendum that has taken place within the regions of Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk about joining Russia.
Again, you follow the Telegram narrative. It's long been expected. It is something that has been part of the conception of Novorossiya for years. And when I'm not surprised that he called it up for that, for a number of reasons. We have been looking over the past couple of months at how slow the war has been going. And some have said that this is just because Russia does not have the military wherewithal that many people had expected. That may be true, but I think that there was an overestimation of Russia's military capability that many people, including myself, felt in the first 2 weeks of the war, where we thought that it would be over as quickly as possible. They go for Kiev, they decapitate the leadership, they engage in regime change like the United States does, and then they can have their way with the rest of Ukraine. When that proved to either be unsuccessful or there was an agreement behind the scenes to change tactics, they suddenly switched to, just like intricate military intervention in these eastern regions. And they were effectively going town by town, not just capturing the settlements, but also changing around the leadership. So even within the Telegram channels, which, again, I'm not saying that these are the primary sources, but these are things that sort of are missed in mainstream media, that the leadership is pro-Russian, pro-Moscow. The Ukrainian leadership has been replaced. So it really looks like they have been, taking, capturing, coring, and then transitioning. So to make the announcement that these 4 regions would hold referendums for Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk already declared, quasi-independence, and this is sort of the fast track for Kherson and Zaporozhye, is not surprising. What it does is it gives Russia a land bridge to Crimea. And what it also shows is that Russia has been far more invested in capturing and integrating Ukraine's east and south than it has been its north. That may also explain why the Kherson counteroffensive was largely a failure. And Russia, the fact that they pulled back from so many settlements in the north, you can play this one way or the other. I mean, each side has their own narrative to this. The Russian side, take it however way that you want, is that Kharkiv was never a major target. There was never an attempt at trying to capture it in the same way as Mariupol. And that the fact that they had yielded so much territory was that it was just simply a bargaining chip, right? So Ukraine exerts all of its forces up in the north, but yet they cannot penetrate the south. I think that the holding on referendums was a bit earlier than I had anticipated, because there are significant parts of Kherson and Zaporozhye that have yet to be taken by the Russians. And it's especially true with the Zaporozhye Oblast, because the very city of Zaporozhye is still firmly in the hands of Ukraine. So what this may very well all boil down to is a defensive tactic by Russia, in the sense that now that it's part of, or will be recognized very soon as part of Russian territory, we're going to see two things. One, what we most likely will see are those 300,000 signups, enlistees to pacify, to hold these regions, right? Which frees up the special military operation forces, ZV and O, the Wagner groups, the groups from Chechnya to do more heavy fighting, particularly in Zaporozhye and maybe even Nikopol. There still is this idea of whether Odessa will be taken or not. We don't know, but it frees them up, right? It frees them up. The second thing is that it is now seen as Russian territory. So if Ukraine launches strikes against these regions, as they most likely will, right, this is interpreted as an attack on Russian soil, which could escalate conflict even further, right? So it's sort of this changing the legal reality, sleight of hand thing. It's a strategic move by Russia. It's not a subtle move, but Russian foreign policy is many things, but subtlety is nothing that it has ever engaged in.
All right, that is a lot to talk about. But starting out with how you think the forces will be used in Ukraine. I agree with you that they need a large force to kind of hold the territory that they have conquered so far, for the Russians to take control of this area and be able to establish some kind of order. They would need a lot of soldiers for the occupation itself. However, I don't think the new mobilized force will be used for that. I think there will be an addition to the offensive forces. However, by annexing these areas, they are able to use conscripts. So using conscripts that they will just conscript at the time of the referendum to kind of control this area, and then they will use the new mobilized forces as some kind of foot soldiers that they're able to use to storm cities. And with the forces that they've used so far in the war, they're able to make use of them in their most advanced equipment, similarly to tanks, artillery, and so on, so that the ones with the most experience are the ones who will be in the most effective, using the most effective tools in the war. And then the new mobilized forces will be used similarly to the Wagner, Chechens, and the DPR-LPR militias, as in they will be the ones who will be taking over these cities and storming the Ukrainian forces. Also, this way, something like the counteroffensive that happened in Kharkiv, where the Ukrainians completely outnumbered and outgunned the Russians and was able to use their strategic advantage to take on control of these areas very quickly in a very successful counterattack. That will be much more difficult once these 300,000 mobilized forces arrive, as that way it will even out the numbers in this war, where the number of Ukrainian soldiers will be even to the number of Russian soldiers in Ukraine, which will allow the Russians to have much more tactical options in this war, allowing them to do some kind of similar military tactics as the Western media has been promoting. That, for example, at the start of the war, around April to May, there was a lot of talk about how Russia would conquer the Donetsk region, because everyone expected them to conquer it quickly. They were talking about going from the north around Bervinkov, here south of Izium, and then pushing southwards towards the Donetsk region, encircling the Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the north, and from the south towards Pokrovsk, encircling the whole Donetsk region. Or even as ambitious as going straight to Dnipro from the north and the south simultaneously. However, they were unable to do that because they only had 200,000 soldiers in Ukraine. Now that they have upwards of 500, 600, or even 700,000 soldiers in Ukraine, then these kind of tactics would be an option on the table for the Russians. So I think it will completely change the situation in the war, as the Russians have a lot more options than what they had earlier. However, the question is, how long will it take for Russia to actually mobilize these 300,000 forces, give them the necessary training, and insert them into Ukraine with all the necessary equipment? So there's a lot of unknown factors that we don't know yet. However, I think that the situation will rapidly develop in the next coming weeks, and we will see the reality of the situation once most of the forces are ready. Do you have any comments on that?
There's a lot there I was thinking about here. I mean, a few things. Certainly with the addition of 300,000 forces, yeah, I do agree that this gives Russia a bit more. First of all, it gives them more of a tactical advantage. And I think that we also need to remember that Russia is in this really for the long game. They still hold long-term tactical advantage. They have more money, they have more troops, they have more weapons, and they're doing all of the fighting in Ukraine. So the infrastructure of Russia itself is not being damaged. What they also have is that the referendums themselves will, I think, as you mentioned, free up not just people who are fighting within those regions, but now will give people within those states, whether it's the impetus or whether it is the moral duty, right, to liberate the rest of their territory. In the same way that we have the Donetsk and the Luhansk militia groups that were doing most of the fighting within the original Donbass, and the special military forces were doing most of the heavy lifting in Kherson and Zaporozhye. What also seems likely is whether or not the successful annexation, mobilization, and capture of territories could be repeated in additional regions. There's no evidence to suggest that this is all that is part of the Russian military objective. And more to the point, I think that it's Russia's military objectives have been rather fluctuating, right? They've changed over the past couple of months. And we can certainly talk about, Putin's rhetoric and Lavrov's rhetoric, later on. But it seems like, initially the goal was to effectively execute regime change in Ukraine, put a Yanukovych type of leader back in Kiev, and there wouldn't be a need for military annexation. Now, all of a sudden there is. And once you declare the independence, once you recognize the independence of two pieces of territory to another country, it doesn't matter how bad it's going for that country. The target country will never recognize the loss of its territory unless they are, absolutely defeated. And as long as Ukraine can rely on continuous support from the West, economic support, military hardware support, military training, it keeps them in the game. What's more is that the counteroffensive, and this, is ultimately there were three victories. There were three victories in this counteroffensive. In the degree of less important to most important, I'm going to go. The least important of the three victories is that the Ukrainian army recaptured towns and villages, including Izium. Right, this was the big one. A more important victory is that they won the propaganda war, or at least they won the war of the narrative that Ukraine can fight back. And this was considered to be a major symbolic victory, regardless of how much they engaged with Russian forces, regardless of whether Russia ordered the troops to be pulled back and the Ukrainian army moves into deserted villages. This is a major turn of events. The most important victory that Zelensky had received from this is that he proved to his Western backers that he can take territory back, he can win wars, And this justified the next $1 billion aid package to Ukraine, right? If he wasn't able to do this already, there was military fatigue that was, that was setting in. So this is going to be a long, drawn-out conflict. And with the addition of these 300,000 soldiers, I don't know how long it's going to be before the Ukrainians that are being trained elsewhere around the world will also be met. But we also have to wonder, was this one of those Hail Mary gambles that Zelensky had done in the Kharkiv region? How much of his military inventory is still there? Did he throw everything in? And was this sort of an all or nothing, was this an all or nothing gamble? And, how many troops, how many soldiers, what were the casualties? What was the cost in taking the territory back, right? The Ukrainians have been very mum on the number of casualties. And usually, you want to find out how many soldiers have been killed on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides. You take the Russian statistic, you take the Ukrainian statistic, and you sort of realize the numbers are somewhere, in the middle here. But if this really is, if this was an all or nothing gamble and he won, but it cost him his military reserves, then if Russia is able to mobilize as you had suggested, and they're able to turn the tide back before the winter sets in, the momentum could very well be back within Russia's camp.
Very interesting points that you touch upon. And I agree with your sentiment about the allocation of forces and these kind of things. All right, so I want to quickly touch upon some of the comments that we've received on this live stream. First of all, there's a lot of people who say that you sound very pro-Russian. So would you make clear your stance on this war? What do you think of it? And if there's a side that you support, which is it? And finally, talk quickly about your channel and what you do and what the objective of your channel is.
Right. So I'll answer all of that really with one question here, because with one answer. There was, in one of my last videos on my Russian foreign policy class, and I was discussing the conditions that led up to the outbreak of conflict in Ukraine in the beginning of this year. And the evidence, at least from Russia's side, has been repeatedly articulated in addresses coming from Putin, from Lavrov, that NATO has been encroaching on what Russia regards as its own security spheres of influence, that Ukraine is infiltrated with a whole bunch of far right-wing nationalists that are working to de-Russify the country. At the end of the day, the $64,000 question is, does this justify Russia invading Ukraine? And the answer is no, it does not, right? It does not justify the invasion. It does not justify an invasion, and it also does not justify the amount of destruction, right, that has occurred in the last 7 months. And so with that, Russia has always been on the defensive because it is regarded as the aggressor country. It invades another country. It invades the sovereign territory of another country while saying, right, that Russia upholds the sovereign independence of countries around the world, right? It claims to offer these lofty arguments at the UN, but then when it doesn't get what it wants, it just kind of turns around and says, well, screw you, we're just getting what we want, and we're just, sort of taking territory here, right? So, the argument isn't necessarily pro-Russian. It's just it's effectively just looking at the realities on the ground and saying that you don't have to be in favor of this war. I mean, look, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed, that have been wounded, that have been displaced. The very fact that there are so many Russians that are now leaving the country shows that there is growing discontentment with Vladimir Putin, especially for people younger than 30 years old, because they have no working knowledge of anything Russia before Putin. The older generation can kind of look to him as this, bedrock of stability when they compare him with the chaos of the 1990s. The younger generations are sort of fed up with this guy. And the fact that we're now at war with another country that we ostensibly say are the closest people to us, culturally, linguistically, religiously, historically speaking, and yet we're murdering them left and right. It just sort of creates this cognitive disconnect. So I'm not pro-Russian, but I'm not pro-Ukrainian. I'm anti-war, and I'm pro finding an agreement that will end this conflict. And unfortunately, Ukraine is, I think, so far down the commitment rabbit hole right now that it can't sue for peace. It tried doing that within a few weeks of the outbreak of the war. First by meeting with Russian officials, in some border town in Belarus, and then in Istanbul, and the information coming in was that the United States, and specifically the United Kingdom, was egging Zelensky on, saying, "Don't give up, and keep fighting, and we're going to give you just enough to defend yourself, but not to actually." Take back Crimea, not to restore Ukraine to its 2014 borders. I understand that there is a second war. There is a parallel war going on besides the actual war between Russia and Ukraine, and that's the war on social media. And if one does not openly condemn Russia, they're pro-Russian. If one does not openly support Ukraine, they're anti-Ukrainian, or they're pro-Ukrainian, or they're pro-Zelensky, they're anti-Russian, they're pro. It's a spectator sport, unfortunately. I understand this is an incredibly delicate subject to talk about. So, I mean, no, I'm not necessarily pro-Russian, but I'm certainly not buying in the narrative of the media industrial complex that is coming through the local CNNs and the Washington Post and the New York Times.
I like your response. It's very honest and straightforward. Okay, so and a quick note about your videos. A lot of your videos are translations of speeches by Lavrov and by Putin. And I want to say that they really helped me understand the situation because I don't speak Russian. So having these translations allows me to analyze the situation better, as I am able to listen to what they say and what their rhetoric is like, which allows me to better understand what the situation is. Which brings me to the next question. Has the rhetoric of Putin's speeches changed recently, or is it the same as the start of the war?
Okay, so I realized I forgot to sort of talk a little bit about my YouTube channel. You did here, so let me preface. Let me start with that, and then we'll go into the rhetoric here. So I decided in February to provide these translations for one very important reason. They're not available any other place. You will find little bits and pieces of speeches, especially by Putin, that either are the voice dub over from the interpreter that's translating as they're listening, and it can be rather, it can be sort of there's a disconcerting, thing to it. People really can't concentrate on that, or they'll just take a post speech translation, but they'll take only one part of that. And I wanted to get the whole thing, so I was able. So I have a software program called Camtasia, and this is not the part where we start advertising software, but I have this video editing software that allows me to put in closed captioning, and I am able to understand Russian, and I do, and if I can find, let's say, a transcript of the speeches that are offered in English, that usually gives me about 85% of the way there, and then I'll tweak here or there. But I did it primarily because I wanted people to get the full thing without any commentary, without any bias, without anything else. If you thought that he was a lunatic beforehand and you listened to his speeches and you walk away thinking, yes, he's a lunatic, but now I know why he's a lunatic, well, now you have it. If you supported him and you listen to him and you now support him even more, then that is what it is. So the comments that I have on these pages, unless they are particularly egregious, I let them all in. And there are, yes, it has become somewhat of a center for people that are happy that this is being provided where Western media isn't doing so. I don't have an agenda. I'm just a university professor. But I feel that, yes, it has, drawn traffic to my page. It certainly was useful when I offered my Russian foreign policy class to the general audience in the name of public scholarship. And I originally started with Zelensky videos as well. The only reason why I don't do Zelensky videos now is because his own YouTube page provides the subtitles. So their side is doing the work for me. So I don't feel like I need to replicate something that they've already done. One would think, right, that the Kremlin's page, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they do provide the translated script, but they don't provide the subtitles. And if they did that, well, then I would have a lot more time to grade papers and do other things here. So when they do come out, I know that there is now an interest in that, but I leave the speeches as is, and for the general audience to to make up their own mind. Now, with all of that said, I sort of now have become sort of a self-proclaimed experts on the speeches that Putin gives. And so the question is, has his rhetoric changed, or has it remained relatively the same? Most of the stuff has remained the same. When he is giving a scripted address that does not involve him taking questions from the press. So the narrative is still pretty straightforward from not just this past February, but from late December of last year, right? And they usually fall around the following, right? Number one, the conditions of Russians in Ukraine have become unsustainable, have become unlivable over the past 8 to 9 years. Russia has been very patient with Ukraine, expecting them to abide by, among other things, the Minsk II Accords, but also to abide by just general principles of minority rights and representation. And this has been repeatedly violated, according to the Russian side. And Russia has just lost patience with not just this government of Volodymyr Zelensky, but the one of Petro Poroshenko. Ukrainian political culture at the same time has been, according to Putin, Lavrov, the Russian side, infiltrated by elements of the far right that the Western community at best ignores, at worst condones and supports. This leads to this whole idea that Ukraine is infiltrated and full of neo-Nazis, which makes Western journalists scratch their heads, wondering, does he really mean what he says? And, there's certainly meaning and symbolism within all of that. The US and the UK, according to Putin, are using Zelensky as a puppet for their larger agenda. The war is a proxy war. Zelensky really has no independent agency. And as such, he's effectively allowing NATO to infiltrate and seep into Ukrainian territory and threaten Russia's security. At the same time, the Ukrainian people, according to Putin, are almost one and the same. As far as Russia, historically, they are intimately connected. They are the closest thing that we have to brothers, and therefore this idea that how could our own people betray us and go towards the West that has done absolutely nothing for them, and as such, right, Russia has no choice but to take action. Right? If they don't take action now, the window of opportunity is lost. NATO is effectively on Russia's doorstep, and therefore, according to Putin, right, the war, the invasion, is completely justified. Now, it's a nice narrative. It's a nice narrative if you listen to this. If you listen to this one time and one time only. But as I said before, all of this, the one thing that seems to disconnect from all of this is that the military action seems unclear. We don't know what is Russia's end goal, because if all of what I just said is true, then the entire country needs to be rescued, saved, invaded, what have you, not just the eastern areas. So if all that he's doing is simply talking about Donbass, 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 there are more Russians that live in Ukraine than just Donbass. And how many of them identify as Russian, or just simply being able to speak Russian? But identifying as Ukrainian. If we recognize that Ukrainians are like Russians as well, then all of them effectively should be protected. Not just these 4 oblasti that are now, engaging in these referendums where the outcome was pretty much assumed, and the annexation is, a little more than 24 hours, 48 hours away. So I think his rhetoric has remained relatively the same. He has his talking points that he falls back on. And at least as far as his audience is concerned, it gives Russia this, if not a legal right, a moral right, to intervene. But again, it's another country being invaded. And at the end of the day, Ukraine benefits from this, from being the one that is invaded. Right? Ukraine did not invade Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. And as such, the burden of proving that they have a point remains on Moscow's side.
All right, very interesting points altogether. So the final two questions, I wonder which there. I guess I'll start with what the people are talking about in chat, which has now switched to the Nord Stream pipelines, where the past couple of days, or I think 2 days ago, Nord Stream pipeline 1 and 2 have both been blown up in two different areas each. And the culprit is unknown and the motive is unknown. No one has taken responsibility for it, and everyone is accusing everyone for it. What is your take on it?
Well, I don't really buy the argument that it was Russia that sabotaged it. And not surprisingly, the hardliners in the EU, the Baltic states, Poland, and Ursula von Leyen are very quick to say that this was Russia's doing. If Russia wanted to deny gas to Northern Europe, especially Germany, all they have to do is just shut the valves. They don't need to destroy property. The only argument that I could see is that by sabotaging the pipelines, Russia is not obligated to pay for the service to Germany, right? It doesn't work, then they're under no financial obligation. But I think more to the point, and this is really going down the rabbit hole, right? That if there was sabotage, it may have come more so from the U.S. side. It's rather coincidental that a new pipeline from Norway through Denmark into Poland, is operational roughly around the same time. You can always go back into the history of statements made by Biden that, if this thing escalates, we're going to punish Russia economically. You can come up with your own conspiracy theories, and certainly there's a Telegram channel that will validate one side or the other. But personally, from my own perspective here, like Russia is being accused of bombing their own soldiers, bombing their own controlled nuclear power plants, and now bombing their own pipelines. I mean, after a while, if Russia is this self-sabotaging, you have to wonder how they've already been this successful in Ukraine. So, my own thoughts on this, and again, I don't have, empirical evidence to show, and something tells me that we're never going to find that and even if we do, it doesn't matter. The press is going to, post whatever they want. There's clearly a signs of sabotage, but it looks like it could very well be from someone other than Russia, simply to deny, right, Russia's access to this. Because what's important about Nord Stream is that it's like VIP access for Germany to get all of this gas. And now that Germany does not have this, right? So there's talks about how the pipelines can be repaired, but it could take a very, very long time. Why bother doing it now? It's, Russia's not going to turn the gas back on. It takes away a bargaining chip that Germany had, right? Germany's much more conciliatory. Germany wants to cut a deal with Russia. But if there is no Nord Stream right now, then that's nothing for them to take into consideration. What we also find is both Maria Zakharova as well as Dmitry Peskov today have openly said that this is going to be, economically disastrous for Russia as well. So I find it hard to believe that it would be the Russian side. And if it turns out that it actually is, you can have me again on, third time around, and I'll say, well, I was wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's hard to believe that Russia would sabotage its own economic income. As you mentioned, the ones who can gain from this pipeline is Russia and Germany. Germany receives cheap gas directly to them from Russia, and Russia gets a market to sell their own gas. Currently, the situation in Russia with the gas is that they have such a large surplus that they are actually burning whatever they get out because they have too much. So instead of burning up money like it's whatever else you like to burn, you could sell it to Germany through the Nord Stream pipelines. But they're not doing that. And in this situation, what could they gain from blowing up their own pipeline that they own 100% of Nord Stream 2 and 51% of Nord Stream 1? So there's no incentive here for them to do so. However, as you mentioned, this was a bargaining chip for both Germany and Russia. With the Nord Stream active, then there was more incentive for Germany to make peace with Russia, as that would allow them to receive this gas again. That is actually having a crippling effect on the German economy. I think the recent numbers were saying somewhere around 10 to 15% of the German GDP is being used on gas because they have to pay so much more now than they used to. So generally speaking, I would put the blame somewhere around Western countries like the United States or the United Kingdom. As you mentioned earlier, the news seemed to believe that the UK Boris Johnson actually went to Zelensky and sabotaged a peace deal early in April. So someone around there has the incentive and the intention to prolong this war, or at the very least get out a positive outcome for Ukraine rather than what we're seeing so far on the field. So somewhere around the UK or the United States are the most likely suspects, as they want to keep Germany in this on their side away from Russia. And the Nord Stream pipeline was the biggest reason for Germany to make peace. So this essentially forces Germany to stay with this side or gain nothing.
Right.
Yeah. And then the final question: what are significant points in Sergei Lavrov's speech that are important to talk about? And by this speech, I mention both the speech around the press conference in the United Nations and also his speech at the United Nations that was directly to the United Nations members states.
So, just as a shameless shout out, a shameless plug, both of those speeches are fully translated and they're on my YouTube channel for everyone to comment on. Lavrov's narrative is also very much in it hasn't deviated much since the outbreak of conflict, and it is very much in harmony with Putin's viewpoints. That's not surprising. They're part of the same government, but Lavrov is one of the few within Putin's inner circle that has been given far more autonomy to speak his mind, to engage, to argue. I think I mentioned this in our previous conversation, but it's worth repeating. Lavrov shows signs of reading a number of academic works within political science and international relations. And I say that because of the words that he uses. He talks about multipolarism versus unipolarism, the end of American unipolar hegemony he talks about. He makes references to world civilizations that have their own unique histories and developments and values. And this is in connection to the works of Sam Huntington and his work, his infamous work, his famously infamous and infamously famous work, Clash of Civilizations. And recently, he mentioned John Mearsheimer, who is a longtime scholar within international relations, someone who has also been sort of pigeonholed as somebody who is "quote unquote" pro-Russian for deviating from the usual narrative. But what that means is that he's trying to create an intellectual argument in saying that American unipolarism has now come to a definitive end. I think that end really was marked with the collapse of the pro-American government in Afghanistan last year, and how quickly the Taliban took over. And the literature within international relations has long talked about how unipolarism doesn't last long, because states will almost inherently work to balance against them, either aggressively or passively. American unipolarism had nearly, I would say, a 20-year run, which is long by unipolar standards. One could say, let's say, roughly from the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the first 10 years from 91 to 01 were American unipolarism in its ascendancy. I think the 9/11 attacks were the first to erode that, but the United States still maintains a significant degree of power and influence. And even today, right, Lavrov has not denied that a multipolar world includes the United States, right? The United States is not a declining power. It's no longer a hegemon. And a hegemon is one that has unchecked, unbridled power. The United States is a regional power. It may even very well be a world power along with Russia, China, India, either Saudi Arabia or Iran, the word still out is there, Argentina or Brazil. So to this, Lavrov is talking about first of all simply power realignments within the multipolar world, right? And within the IR studies, this is just simply looking at how powers wax and wane. And this is nothing particular against the U.S., right? Rome rose and fall, Britain rose and fell. The United States is now receding in that same light. But he's also bringing in a cultural aspect to this. And Putin does this, but Lavrov even more so, where Russian foreign policy, it doesn't have necessarily it doesn't have a philosophy beyond just simply this idea of sovereign democracy, right? And I know that we talked about this last time around, and there was a few of your viewers that I was having discussions with back and forth, which I thought was really great in the comment sections about what exactly sovereign democracy is. But it is the understanding that states, powerful states, with defined identities and histories and legacies and traditions should have absolute authority over their decisions. And they should not be beholden to other bigger powers like the EU or NATO or the United States. And therefore, Russia is sort of setting the example that we no longer just simply do what the Americans want. And it's also with this understanding that American foreign policy has been more destructive than helpful, with regime changes in Iraq, in Libya. He also frequently brings up, Lavrov also frequently brings up the 1999 NATO bombardment of Yugoslavia/Serbia over, at the time, the United States was supporting secessionism in Kosovo. Now, this is something that Lavrov always uses as well, if you can do it, why can't I, right? Albanians in Kosovo don't want to be part of Serbia. So they orchestrate a security dilemma, which gets the Serbian forces to crack down. They turn to the United States and they say, this is ethnic cleansing, this is genocide. It's a long, I'm really going through this fast because I'm skipping over a lot of steps here. But ultimately, the United States feels that they are compelled to support the Albanian separatists, design a country outside of UN legal Security Council resolutions, which is the reason why Kosovo remains a parastate today. It's recognized by under 100 countries. So Russia sees this and says, okay, well, if you can do that, well, then I can do the same thing as well. And I can do this to Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. I can do this to Crimea in Ukraine. We can support, for a while, the Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan. And what makes them different than the situation in Kosovo? And he really doesn't care if there is a difference or not, but he's waiting for the Western response by saying, well, that was different. Well, that's an exceptional case. So it's kind of like the kid at the playground who is not prepared for the answer, and the only thing that they can say is that, well, that's not fair, that doesn't count. To which Lavrov then turns around and says, well, I'm sorry, but if you're engaging in great power politics, then so can we. Now, here is where the logic breaks. Okay, Lavrov goes to this big, long-winded talk about the legal imperative of multipolarism in the world and how important the United Nations is to organize a number of these countries into working together to solve transnational problems that no one country can solve. And the United States needs to realize that they need to be sitting at a table, not mandating from a podium. Okay, I got it. But the minute that Russia has the opportunity to engage in 19th century realpolitik, they're going to do so. And they're going to say, well, it's within our own interests. And you can come up with all kinds of, legal excuses, rationales for the people of Donbass have been subjected to genocide and ethnic cleansing, and show me the details, right? Show me the evidence. You can't just simply say that this has been. Now, there's evidence that Ukraine has been, bombing and harassing and, certainly making life as miserable as possible for those in Donbass, which has alienated the population. There's no question about that, right? But does that give Russia the right then to all of a sudden seize this territory and claim it for its own, while still saying that the United States does not have the right to do so with Kosovo in Serbia? So to answer your question, the quick answer is Lavrov has remained rather steady in his own narrative. But when he is asked, and I encourage people to check out the press conference that he gave after the speech, because when he's asked questions from friendly countries, he's able to expound on these narratives. When he has to address sort of inconvenient realities from Western journalists, and there were two within this press conference. One was, why are so many Russians leaving Russia? And he gave a one-word answer, which was more of a question before deflecting that. And the other one was something to the effect of, what is Putin's grand plan for Ukraine? What is the ultimate objective? And this would have been a fantastic time for Lavrov to give it, but he didn't. Instead, he kind of chided the journalist and said, Putin has been very clear in these speeches. I invite you to go and check them out for yourself, right? So, and then he turns around and says, you can, if you're not satisfied with what I say, you can tell your readers that I deflected your question, that I refused to answer your question, which I've no doubt that that's what she's going to say, right? So he's very good when he is not challenged with this narrative. When he is, either he has to stay within script, or it's very difficult for countries, Russia, the US, any major country, to stay within the script of international legal parameters without going into great power politics. We can do it because we want, right? We can do it because we want, because we can, because we have an army. And what are you going to do about it? The United States says that, Russia is saying that. And what that ultimately does is it opens up the possibility for any country with the military wherewithal to do that, to effectively say, when there's nothing else left, when all is, when in doubt, when all else fails, use the military to get what you want. And I think that that's also happening right now in Azerbaijan, as the regions of Karabakh are being eaten up, bit by bit.
Thank you very much for your answer. And although I did say that this was the last question, I have one more that I forgot about. And that is, tomorrow there will be the speech by Putin on the subject of these referendums. The past 3 hours, I think 3 hours ago, a lot of sources came from I think it was the speaker or someone around an official from the Kremlin, a speaker for the Kremlin, saying that Putin's speech will be about the annexation of the areas and that he will sign the decrees tomorrow. So let's talk a bit about that.
He is going to frame this most likely within the argument of Vox Populi, right? There was a referendum. The people were given an opportunity to vote in that referendum. They had more rights to express their will of self-determination than the Albanians of Kosovo or the Turks of Cyprus or any other disputed territory. So as far as he's concerned, this is raw democracy. All right, the people voted. This is the will of the people, and what they ultimately want is to simply return to Russia. And Russia is going to honor the will of that people. So within that narrative, it's very straightforward, and it sort of affirms what many people had suspected in months ago, and that was Russia is really interested in just simply annexing territory. And again, it's very obvious that the territories provide Russia with a land bridge to Crimea. This was one piece of territory that before anything else happened, Russia would never, ever, ever give up. And I think was one of the things that stalled the peace agreements as soon as the war broke out, because Zelensky wanted to put Crimea on the table. Russia said, this is about Donbass, not about Crimea. And this was something that I think that Zelensky could not refuse, because that would be political suicide for him, given the nature of political culture in Ukraine. So, it's the referendums that everybody suspected and knew what the outcomes were going to be. Surprise, surprise. Whether or not everyone voted, which I doubt that they did, the facts are clear. They have the receipts, and everything seems ready to simply extend Russian territory into southern Ukraine.
I want to mention something. This is a hypothesis from me, and you can take it with a grain of salt. But I see Zelensky's position as leader of Ukraine similar to that of Winston Churchill. Prior to the war in Ukraine, Zelensky's popularity was very low, even for a Ukrainian leader. I think his approval rating was somewhere around 10%, which is extremely low. However, there's no denying that right now he's extremely popular. That's why I draw this relation to Winston Churchill. He was a wartime leader. Everyone loved him when he was a leader during the Second World War. But even before the Second World War officially ended, before Japan capitulated, they held an election and Winston Churchill was voted out. And that is because in the situation that the Ukrainians achieve a peace treaty and actually win the war, they take back the Donbass region, maybe Crimea, maybe not, who cares, in this hypothesis, not in general. If you take offense to that, my bad. Anyways, so in the scenario that this war ends, I believe that Zelensky will most likely not be re-elected. I think that is because he'll be seen as a wartime leader, someone who saved the country and all of these things. He'll become a national hero. But barely anyone in Ukraine will see him as a leader who is fit to restore the economy and push Ukraine forward. He has so far failed to achieve any major success in the economy between 2019 and 2022. And he has not successfully restored peace with the Donbass region as he was campaigning for, and a lot of other things. He has politically failed as a leader, but militarily, so far, he seems to have succeeded very well. So I draw connections here with Winston Churchill, who was a wartime leader. He succeeded very well in the war. He was what the country needed at the time. And I see that Zelensky is the same. Zelensky is what Ukraine needs right now. But once the war's over, I believe that his term will finish and he'll probably go on to Israel or the United States and just live out a luxury life with what he's achieved.
Oh, CNN will offer him a job as a political commentator. That's what happens. People in that category, they never fade. They're just they're given cushy jobs on CNN or MSNBC. He can co-host with Fareed Zakaria.
And he'll probably get a comedy show on Netflix.
Yeah, he's definitely going to be called on to Late Night with Stephen Colbert. There's no question about that. Yeah, that's certainly the case. I don't know if I would put him in the same category as Winston Churchill. I don't know who I would compare him to, but you're absolutely right. His popularity right now is really for a couple of reasons. One, he's not a politician, and that's what got him elected in the first place. He kind of presents himself as an ordinary man, which we need to remember. Before he was popular and before he was unpopular, he was elected into office in 2019 on a landslide victory. Like, he just absolutely decimated Poroshenko in the polls. I mean, we are talking about like a 75% in favor turnout. I think a lot of that had to do with the public being absolutely disgusted with Poroshenko. And the problem is that anybody that becomes the president of Ukraine ends up becoming unbelievably unpopular because they're unable to turn around the endemic corruption that's within the country, right? We have to forget. I mean, I know Western media likes to portray Ukraine as this paragon of democracy, this little scrappy country that just deserves to be within the European Union. And I mean, it makes for a good story. But historically speaking, for 30 years, Ukraine was, and unfortunately, just led by one dysfunctional hybrid regime after another. Most of those were pro-Moscow, and in the few cases where they were pro-Washington, the nepotism, the clientelism, the grafting was just simply redirected from one area, really to another. So, Zelensky's inability at, changing around Ukraine's misfortunes or reining in its political extremists, I don't think has much to do with the lack of his own leadership so much as the fact that he really has no power. He really is he became the head of a state that had already been privatized, parcelized, and effectively sold out to various international firms and interests. And take it however way that you want here. The big issue with the grain situation in Ukraine is largely because who owns the grain? Americans own the grain. Saudis own the grain. International companies own the grain. So they're losing money on this stuff not going out. It's not that the Ukrainian grain is going to keep Africa from starving to death, right? It's a nice story that makes it into the media, but when the grain is finally shipped out, one boat goes to Lebanon and the others end up being in Europe. So, where is Africa in all of this? So I feel like Zelensky is very limited in what he can do, but obviously his popularity once the war begins is not surprising because this is a war of survival. I mean, this is total war as far as Ukraine is concerned. This is a do or die scenario here. We are literally talking about towns being annexed to another country. We are talking about old school 19th century. I invade, I take your territory. This is imperial war, effectively. We are talking about the loss of sovereignty, the loss of life, the total destruction of cities. And so in this sense, yes, Zelensky's leadership as a non-politician, I think helps that because people find commonality in that. Right? They see that he's not some political elite like Poroshenko, who, mind you, where's Petro Poroshenko today? He's in Europe, right? He tried multiple times to get out. He finally bribed the right people, him, his family. They're sitting there in cafes. Someone comes up to him and says, hey, what are you doing? Whether it's Austria, Germany, France, I forget where. Shouldn't you be in Ukraine with your own people? And he got visibly annoyed, right? So this is just what happens. Zelensky chooses to stay and fight. And one thing that we do have to give him credit for, and this I will certainly say, is his ability at guilting Europe into helping them, right? He knows that Ukraine is the hashtag of the week. He knows this, and he's not going to pass up that opportunity. He knows that for whatever reason, I stand with Ukraine is the lawn sign that every professional managerial class, New York Times subscribing liberal does. Great. It's in the attention. It's in focus. So we're going to play to the West's heartstrings. We're going to make them feel guilty that they're doing nothing because the enemy is Russia. Russophobia is pathologically ingrained in American, British, and to a lesser extent, Western political culture. It's the perfect scenario here. And so in this case, he's doing what he can do. And whether or not the Ukrainian army has proven itself to be more resilient than we thought, or whether it's just because the West is giving them the military hardware, guess what? After the fall of Liman or Severodonetsk, that was it as far as Russia's victories, right? It remained somewhat of a protracted trench war for most of the summer, in which prior to about a few weeks ago, the understanding was that Russia's holding its positions and we're just grinding the Ukrainian forces until they run out of ammunition, they run out of soldiers, and then they just continue to move forward. As it turns out, right, more than just simply the Kharkiv counteroffensive, this has proven to be the fact that, you know what, Ukraine is determined. If nothing else, we're not going down fighting. So I don't know how the war is going to finish. I don't know what Ukraine is going to look like once it's done. I don't know whether Zelensky will go on to be a hero or whether he will be condemned for signing the agreement that ends the war and having him go from, you know, hero of the hour to traitor of the nation. I don't know. I don't know who will succeed him in that. And I don't know if he will have to pull a Poroshenko and leave before it becomes too dangerous for him. But he has become certainly a major symbolic leader against against Russia, against the non-democratic other around the world.
All right, thank you for that comment. And to correct myself, his approval rating at December 1st, 2021 was a 31%, with 64% disapproving. And the latest poll was February 1st, 2022. Oh, I don't believe that was the date. Probably around March or April. 91% approved and 6% disapproved. So that is a 10 times decrease in disapproval rating and a 3 times increase in approval rating, which is something that is unseen in... it even beats George Bush, the junior guy, surge in popularity after his invasion of Afghanistan. So yeah, I think we will probably end up our stream around here. If you have anything you want to add, we can do that first. Yeah.
Well, Weeb, I would like to thank you for inviting me to your talk here. I thought that we had some really interesting things to discuss. For those that are listening, if you would like to visit my page, it is Michael Rossi, Poli. It's more than just simply translation videos. I also provide courses within political science, specifically international relations, comparative politics. If any of you would like to communicate with me directly, if you have any questions, you can email me. My email is Mike Rossi Poli. Let me just check. I sometimes have to check my own email here. What do we got? It is Mike Rossi Poli at gmail.com. Mike Rossi Poli at gmail.com. So, I'm happy to, clarify, continue the conversations. And this is up on your YouTube channel. I'm happy to interact as I did a little bit beforehand. We are, we're witnessing something that I didn't think that we were going to really in our lifetime. I mean, this is just conventional warfare that is challenging the norms of international law and the Westphalian model as well. I think that, if Putin succeeds, and right now there seems like he could just simply call it a day after these 4 oblasts and call it a small victory. This opens up the door, unfortunately, to a number of other countries with would-be like leaders that say, if you can't get what you want legally, use the military. Will this galvanize China to do something different with Taiwan, right? Will this somehow justify in some last-minute desperate move by Turkey to take northern Cyprus? And I don't know. right? I don't know. But it opens up this idea that it can happen, which means that global security is not preserved, but it is significantly weakened.
Mhm. All right. Thank you for coming to my stream and to my channel again. If anyone wants to check out the latest stream I did with Michael Rossi, I will do that, make that public again. And I will keep this public. I think I don't have any plans of privating it, unlike my other streams. So this will be public for everyone to watch. And thank you all for coming, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me once again.
All right. The stream